Hey everyone, today I'm going to be doing the history book tag. So the first question is, how did I get into history? And if you saw my nonfiction book tag, you'll know I talk about how much I like history and particularly how I initially failed 5th grade because I failed history, or the history component of the class. And so clearly that tells you one thing: it had to be after 5th grade. But I think the short answer is politics. Politics got me interested in socioeconomic issues of today, which then bleeds into the past. But realistically, so when did my interest in politics begin? That would probably be around 2012, as I transitioned from being a Christian and a Republican. I began to expose myself to different ideas. And I remember I particularly got invested in a lot more NPR and PBS NewsHour stuff, basically different things that got me interested in what was going on. And then they got me interested in learning about the past. Now, it wasn't until the last year or so that I really got into reading a lot more history, aside from, say, like nonfiction science history. In general, I'd say the core of my love for history comes from my love for politics. What is your favorite history book and or author? And this one is hard because I don't think I read enough history to really say for sure. If it came to science history, I would say Carl Sagan. Even though he doesn't write particularly about just history, all of his books contain science history, and I think he does so amazingly well. But if I really had to pick, there was only one author I've read more than once so far in my list of history books, and that's Isabel Wilkerson. And so far, I've loved both of her books. I just finished Cass, and it was phenomenal. Highly recommend both of these, obviously. And so I think I have to go with Isabel Wilkerson right now, it's disappointing because she's only written like 2 history books, and they're like 10 years apart. So I would put a close second there, be Ibram X. Kendi, in the sense that I thought this was a really well done history book. It was thick yet concise in a lot of ways and really accessible, and I'm interested in reading his other works. That said, I will also mention another author who I've only read one of so far, but David Sobel writes a lot of science history, and I've bought all of her books at this point, but I've only read one of them, and I'm interested in reading more of them. This is just one example book that I'm hoping to get to, but she's an author who I wouldn't say a favorite yet, but she's a big name in science history that is my go-to. When I think about, I want to learn about science history, I should start with David Sobel. What is your most anticipated history book that you have not yet read? Well, I mentioned David Sobel. Really all of her books. This one, I suppose, because I do love the planets. I would also put Bob Woodward in there because he has some really big books that I feel like I really need to read if I'm really going to call myself someone who loves history and politics. I feel like these are 2 fundamental books in history and politics that I really need to get to. And one more that I will mention as a potential here is going to be A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, which I think look at history through the lens of minorities. This is one I really need to get to next year. To answer the question more directly, the book that I'm honestly most excited for would be this one, which is about Barack Obama's A Promised Land, which is his first autobiography or memoir of his first term. It's so much about this that I love for a lot of reasons, and I ended up binge buying it, and I came very close to reading it this month, even though I've resisted the urge so far. First off, this cover, I love the texture. I love the picture. The way he contrasts with the background, this black and white, is just so beautiful. He's gorgeous. The picture is gorgeous. It's amazing. Also, it's thick. I love myself a thick nonfiction book. Oh my God. I did not notice there's a color picture on the back that really contrasts the front black and white. And one thing I love about this is that it's like over 700 pages, but it doesn't look like it, honestly. It's pretty packed there. So why am I excited for this, besides just how amazing it looks? It's because it's a look. I'm hoping for an honest reflection on his time in his first term, and it'll give me a particular review of his term, but also it'll be interesting to see his perspective on how he thinks he did and how he could have done better, and I guess give me perspective on the things that he has done, because I think there's something that a lot of mistakes or assumptions people make, which is that the president can do anything he or she wants, and if he or she doesn't do exactly what they said they would do, then that must be because they're a liar. And the fact is that the presidency is not as powerful as people seem to think it is. And what's more is that when you're campaigning, you don't have the full picture. I suspect there's probably a lot of complexity that takes place when you become president, to where your choices aren't as black and white. And like in regular life, there are probably a lot of things that are a lot less of a choice than we might think. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm able to look at Obama and say I loved him as a president despite all of his failures, despite all of his shortcomings, because I feel like he did achieve in a lot of ways, even if he didn't achieve as high or as in many ways as I would have liked. And I feel like there is some leniency to be had when it comes to what a president can be expected to do. Also the fact that he just has so much integrity. So he's like the perfect contrast to Trump in so many ways. What is your most favorite time period and why? And what book do you want to read or have read about it? This is something that I'm struggling with, but I suppose I would say that it seems, based off what I'm reading, that my favorite time period would probably be the post-Civil War to sort of pre-Civil Rights era, where you have like Reconstruction and the Jim Crow era and all of the complex issues that are going on in that time period. I also, like when it comes to fiction, I love that time period just as setting-wise. Like I remember watching Boardwalk Empire a while back before I was even into history, and I remember loving the time period as it stands. Obviously I don't love all of it. When it comes to the issues around race, that is one of the most fascinating but also obviously concerning things about that period. And I think that particularly is why it makes it so interesting, because it's so much to learn from on how that was allowed to happen, especially considering the Reconstruction was supposed to prevent that very thing. But I'm really fascinated by it, and I've read a lot of books, or I say I'm gravitating towards a lot of books that seem to be in that general time period. I just read Eleanor Roosevelt's first biography, and even this one I read after being interested in her after reading The Black Cabinet by Jill Watts. And for this pick, I would probably say The Black Cabinet is the one that I recently read that really got me intrigued and fascinated about this period. It was not only just an effective book talking about how the Black Cabinet came into being and how it came out of existence, and then the role it played when it came to building up to the Civil Rights era. It just got me interested in so much to do with this time period, not just with the Black Cabinet itself, but all the figures tangentially related in that time period. And it was just really good. At the time I gave it 4.5 stars, but the more I reflect on it, it's a solid 5-star book. It's probably going to be one of my favorites of the year because it keeps sitting in my mind. Okay, moving on to the next question. What time period would you like to learn more about? Obviously, I want to say that time period I just talked about, but I suppose there's other stuff I'd like to learn about too. One thing I haven't really done is, I guess, branch outside of American history, and I think that's something I need and would like to learn more about. My love of politics has me focusing on that one particular time period, so I suppose learning more about, first thing I would say is probably the ancient Americas before colonization, and then I suppose I'd like to be interested in world history, but to be frank, right now I'm not really that interested. I will say within American history, aside from the one I just mentioned, the Civil War is something I'm intrigued and interested in learning about, even if I'm not necessarily that interested in the war itself. Does that make sense? Like, it's something that I feel is really important for me to understand, given my place as a Southerner, but it's not necessarily something that I find particularly interesting. Is this a war itself? I don't know if I said that right. What history topic would you like to see more fiction or nonfiction books about? Actually, it was not the right answer. I already went through these questions once. I should have known that was not right. What I would like to see more about is more like the Black Cabinet, where we have this piece of history that was been entirely overlooked, about particularly Black history in America. Obviously, I would be remiss if I didn't mention War of the Sons as another situation where we have Black history being discussed in a way that has been ignored largely in history textbooks and in schools. So I guess that I want more like this, more like the Black Cabinet. I want to learn more about this forgotten piece of history. And that's one reason why I'm also interested, I think, in pre-colonized America. In the same way that Black history has been forgotten, so has Indigenous history. What non-book history resources do you enjoy when learning about history? I misread that question, but it just says, what other resources outside of books do I like consuming? Obviously, TV is fantastic. I mentioned the Boardwalk Empire. The Queen is something I'm just now getting into. I feel like fictional films and televisions are a great way to get people interested about the past, even if they're not necessarily and always entirely truthful. So that's one I think that a lot of us can agree on. But there are other things that I would particularly get to that's not fictional, and that would probably be podcasts, because I don't watch a lot of like nonfiction history, but podcasts I do like consuming. Obviously, I have my politics podcast, NPR Politics, NPR Up First, PBS NewsHour. These are all phenomenal resources for modern day politics, but they also occasionally will discuss historical context and how it fits in. I've also found NPR and PBS NewsHour to be a fantastic resource for finding books that I'm interested in when it comes to history and politics. So that's one thing I would say. But then, of course, there are also NPR podcasts that are specifically related to history. There's Throughline, there's Embedded, and there were others that I do not remember. But I think Throughline and Embedded are two of the biggest ones that I actively follow, and I find those to be fantastic resources as well. Okay, I'm getting my questions all mixed up. The question about what time period would I like to learn more about, that actually was a question. I did not misread that question. And then the question I was answered after that, what type of stories or topics would I like to see covered in history, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I answered that after that question. So I suppose that's both questions are answered. This is a bit of a mess of a video. Apologies. I also skipped one question, which is, what is my favorite person in history and what book do you want to read to learn more about them? Right now, I would definitely say I have a fascination with Eleanor Roosevelt, which is what motivated me to read this first in a series of biographies, a trilogy of biographies by Blanche Weiss and Cook. I'm really interested in learning more about her, not only as a political figure, but as a feminist figure, and also when it comes to how she handles race, because that's really what got me interested in here was her place in the Black Cabinet book that I mentioned before. And I don't have the book here to hold up, but honestly, I have like all of Hillary Clinton's books, and I would like to read those. I know that's not exactly history, but I'm going to count it because I do want to learn about her. And besides her, I would also say presidents in general. I think I have a particular interest in learning about presidents and particularly their presidential reign, hence my real fascination with President Obama, who obviously I had the most connection to as someone who grew up in his era. But I'm also interested in all the other presidents, particularly the ones in that sort of post-Civil War era. Another one I'll mention just because why not? Harriet Tubman is one person that I would like to learn more about. I've read one book about her. This is another one I want to read. And then there's others out there to be bought that I'd like to read as well. So I think so far it seems to me that Harriet Tubman is the only person besides Eleanor Roosevelt that I've actually sought out multiple books of to learn more about. That's someone that I'm interested in learning about. And you know what? While we're here, I won't say that she's a favorite figure in history, but there's a new book coming out next year called Madam Speaker about Nancy Pelosi by Susan Page. My love for her as a journalist, as well as my love for Nancy Pelosi, is one that makes this book highly anticipated. So this really fits back to what book am I anticipating reading. But I'd also say Nancy Pelosi is another figure today that I'm interested in learning about. Really, your significant political figures of the today are people that I'm really interested in learning more about. And I should really just give it to the fact that this book tag is history/politics. We're getting close to the end now. Favorite history quote or fun fact? Well, fun fact, I have a lot of books that I have not read that are in history. No, I think what I would go with here is going to be the 4th of July quotation from Frederick Douglass about what the 4th of July means to Black Americans and how it does not mean, cannot mean the same thing as what it means for white Americans because of the liberties that were denied to Black Americans throughout the history of America. And I heard about it back in June or July, right around the time of the recent rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. So that all came together to have a very profound effect on me. And I felt like right now it is the one quote or I guess speech that really stands out in my mind of the things I've been exposed to this year. And I suppose that's an example of something I get introduced to via NPR, not through reading. So I will below, and I will hopefully above and at the end of this video, link to a video that NPR made of Frederick Douglass's descendants, like great-great-grandchildren, basically quoting excerpts from this speech. It was a very powerful video. Highly recommend you watch it. So that'll be the fact or the quote that I would refer to here. And then lastly, shout out booktubers who read history. And obviously, I think most people who are interested in history probably know about Peg from the History Shelf. I mentioned before Jordan from Left on Red. She reads a lot more than just history, but of the history that she reads, it is fascinating. And I'm sure there are more people out there, but that's all that's coming to mind right now. Thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoyed watching this. And as always, hope you have a fantastic day, and I will see you next time.